Dr. Ariyaratne, I think our chair has a technical issue. I think with the interest of time, we can start the presentation. We welcome you to begin the presentation on behalf of everyone. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Tarindi. First of all, I must apologize. I look horrible today. I'm suffering from flu and cold. So I might have to stop here and there to drink water. So if I break my voice, I really apologize in advance. And thank you very much for inviting me, for having me today in this panel. It's an honor. Especially Professor Farzana Hanifa and Dr. Tarindi and the Sociology Department and Professor Herat. I will, since there's a limitation of the time, I'm trying to limit my talk for about maximum half an hour. And then the rest of the time, you can ask questions or share your thoughts. And I'm really looking forward to hear what you think about it and your suggestions or any ideas. Let me share my PowerPoint. Right, you can see that you can see my PowerPoint, right, Tarindi?
Yes, yes, Dr. Ariyaratne,
now, my topic today is researching transgender subjectivities in contemporary Sri Lanka. But my actual topic in the thesis was unframing the self, negotiating transgender identities in contemporary Sri Lanka. Many people ask me why I named it as unframing the self, not framing. I must begin replying to that throughout the course of my research for about 5 years. I have from 2016 to 2021 or to the end of 2020, I have realized that through my research and from my experience in the field, I have unlearned so many things about gender, and particularly on trans communities, and about love, about relationships, about identity. Many things I have unlearned. And I spoke to my supervisor, Dr. Kiran Grewal, and we decided to name it as Unframing because it included a lot of unlearnings and unframings rather than framing or learning. So I must begin with that. And let me move to the next. Right. In the recent past, the interventions of trans scholars effected strong critiques of the organizing principles and theoretical signifiers of feminism and lesbian and gay theory and politics, articulating the productive challenges of transgender for feminism, queer theory, and politics. Social, cultural, and legislative developments reflect the ways in which transgender subjectivities are acquiring increasingly visibility in contemporary Sri Lankan society, making transgender subjectivities as an important and timely area of social and cultural inquiry. As you know, LGBTIQ rights still remain as a stigmatized area of rights activism in Sri Lanka, whereas same-sex relationships are considered criminal. The binary of legality versus illegality signifies the normal versus the other. By remaining silent about trans subjectivities and by criminalizing same-sex activities, the Sri Lankan state has historically exiled all non-normative behaviors of gender and sexuality. It is also important to note that the recognition of transgender subjectivities by medical health sectors and through the registration of documents does not necessarily translate into social and cultural acceptance. The constructed identity of otherness, as Sahu explains it, brings with itself vulnerability and violence for trans communities in Sri Lanka. If I may give a little background to this part, recently, in 2016, the government, through the Ministry of Health, they introduced the gender recognition certificate for individuals who undergo sex assignment surgeries, sex reassignment surgeries, and hormone therapies to change their gender. And after obtaining the gender recognition certificate through another circular from the Registrar General's Department, they can change their gender in the birth certificate and also the driving license, identity card, etc. Therefore, I begin this study with the fundamental argument that the political agency, identity, and everyday lives of trans communities are either suppressed or often overlooked in the dominant narratives. The legacies of colonial governance, education, and cultural influence in Sri Lanka have failed in or deliberately pay no attention to exploring how trans communities maneuver through conventional and discriminatory systems and craft political spaces in their everyday lives. Partha Chatterjee's argument about the nation and its connection to colonization, modernity, and Western philosophical thought provide a solid context to this research, which attempts to critically read the existing knowledge on trans subjectivities in Sri Lanka. The colonial divisions between the political, apolitical, everyday, spectacular, public, private remain and are constantly reproduced and have become the decisive factor in the process of knowledge production. An alternative critical rethinking of such divisions is required to decolonize the knowledge that currently dominates gender discourses. Therefore, the main research problem explored in this study is how contemporary transgender communities understand, construct, and negotiate their gender identities beyond the hegemonic narrations of gender and identity. To understand contemporary dialogues in the public domain on gender, sex transformation in Sri Lanka, it is first necessary to accept the fact that colonialism and other global discourses have enormously influenced how social norms on gender in the global south are determined and shaped. Even though an understanding of the history and context might suggest a different view of trans communities in Sri Lanka, there are various advocacy and policy documents that reiterate the discrimination and violence they experience today. Therefore, it remains politically necessary to understand and perhaps deconstruct the term gender identities. In other words, what exactly do the terms gender or identity mean to a Sri Lankan transgender person today? In deconstructing the term within the local context, it is necessary to acknowledge the fact that associated concepts such as violence, agency, or freedom do not have abstract meanings, but they are negotiated within a matrix of power, as Judith Butler suggests us. What is the new perspective that their everyday lives bring to our knowledge? How does this challenge our traditional judgments and perspectives on identities and lives in the periphery? Can we critically rethink of our lives for new ways to understand the concepts of family, motherhood, love, romance, and even sexuality? These research questions encapsulate all these individual questions. The research is positioned in the theoretical realm of subaltern studies that is based on the histories of communities that are socially, politically, and geographically outside of hegemonic power structures in colonial and post-colonial societies. This study uses critical feminist theory as a lens to study the underlying normative biases entrenched in the foundation of conventional gender roles in society and discusses how gender relations are negotiated by trans community members through their performativity. Further, it adopts intersectionality theory to conceptualize knowledge as situated, contextual, relational, and reflective of diverse social, political, and economic hierarchies. The study highlights the importance of adopting multiple frameworks that avoid universal or essentialist claims, regarding transgender communities and identities. Therefore, the notion of trans identities in this thesis is not an essential or fixed one. Rather, it is a position which is always in negotiation with the outside world, a position arising as a result of the intersectional hierarchies and power relations in a particular place at a particular moment. Seeing the complexities of the lives I observed, I did not start work with a presumption or a hypothesis. Rather, I began questioning the existing presumptions, following an inductive method whereby the key arguments are unfolded throughout the course of the research process, which led to challenging and deconstructing many of the accepted versions and perceptions of contemporary transgender lives. The research methodology includes a cultural, historical, and textual analysis, along with an ethnographic study which conducted from 2016 to 2020. My experience was based on my formal and informal interactions with several trans individuals, primarily in Colombo, Kandy, and Gaul, organizations based in Colombo, psychiatrists also who practiced in Colombo, and some activists from Colombo and North Central Province. Connections were made through personal relationships first, followed by snowballing sampling method. I found that my emotions were unavoidable in this study, but at the same time, I was always critically self-aware of my positionality as a cisgender queer woman that may have affected my understanding of the transgender bodies in this research. Due to the time constraint, I will not elaborate on the challenges and ethical considerations much, but I must highlight the fact that the difficulty in finding a proper English term was a challenge for me. I found that the Western terminologies are often insufficient to build a discursive analysis of transgender identities in Sri Lanka, such as Nachi community, who share unique histories and practices. The term transgender is used throughout the thesis as a term of political analysis to refer to the diverse forms of resistance to conventional gender norms in society. It may not necessarily be the term employed in various other contexts, but it is intended to capture the politics which underlie the taking on and non-mainstream gender identities. Therefore, when the term transgender is used in this thesis, it does not necessarily imply that this is the identity of a special group of people, but rather it gives us an understanding of the ways in which they experience their non-conformity. I was careful to make a note how they wished to introduce themselves, and I have used the term Nachi, woman or man, wherever they identify themselves as such. However, given the associated social stigma of terms such as Nachi and transgender in Sri Lanka, it would be confusing to use them here as politically subversive terms. That would involve much larger scholarly and activist work going well beyond the limits of the study. I have divided my thesis into mainly two parts. The first part I named as revisiting neoliberal knowledge. That part one, revisiting neoliberal knowledge, I divided again into two parts. One part is the ominous image of Nachi sex worker, communities, spaces, and subaltern counterpublics. That part explores the experiences and narrations of Nachi sex workers in Colombo and its suburbs. The objective was to critically read the discourses of the state and civil society on trans sex worker and to contradict and debunk some of the generalized narratives about being a member of vulnerable or marginalized community. Based on Foucault's argument about rights being simultaneously emancipatory and regulatory, democratic and constraining, I explored how trans sex workers negotiate and work through law and human rights frameworks, looking closely at their everyday lives, performativity, love, and romance through their narrations. I argue that this established and hegemonic homogeneous identity of trans sex worker is highly inadequate and fails to penetrate the complexities of their lives, thus portraying an incomplete picture. And I explained how they create subaltern counter publics, as Nancy Fraser introduced us, within their own spaces, finding their own solutions. The next part is to be or not to be seen, paradoxes of identities among trans men in Sri Lanka, which I have also published in Masculinities Journal after the submission of the thesis. It discusses female to male transgender identities of those who have chosen to undergo hormone therapy and sex reassignment surgeries. It provided insight about the everyday lives, realities, and expectations of several young trans men in Sri Lanka who were in their journey of pursuing an ideal, complete life of a man by changing their bodily organs and undergoing hormone therapy. I discuss how masculine and abled bodies demanded by capitalist forms of production in the modern world offer avenues for them to explore and understand their bodies. Further, I argued that the regulations brought by the post-war Sri Lankan state for a person to move from one binary to another is part of the long-term Sri Lankan nation building project. Through this, I have developed my argument that contemporary trans lives and identities are being constructed by capitalist neoliberal state, and that these constructs are maintained and reproduced not only by Althus's ideological state apparatus, but also by rights-based non-governmental and civil society actors. After critically analyzing the existing knowledge produced by the state and neoliberal institutions, I then attempted to respond to it with an alternative reading of trans subjectivities in the part 2 of my thesis, Interrogating the Everyday. The first part of that, the part 2, was Horse is Heavy, but My Heart is Not, Dancing Identity and the Politics of the Subaltern, discussed dance practices, which I identify as an essential part of the lives of Nachi groups in Sri Lanka. The moment of jogi, which resembles Bakhtin's idea of the carnivalesque, is more than a method of generating income for dancers. During her dancing, the dancer steps out of the territory of her marginalized identity and casts an oppositional gaze to the socio-political systems that preside over her every day and thus express her agency. Dancing is a style of living, a hobby for their leisure time, a space for meeting new people and building new relationships, and a moment used to express themselves, to enjoy their freedom and celebrate their identities. The second part of the part 2, titled Priest, Woman and Mother, Broadening Horizons Through Transgender Subjectivities, I looked into a particular case study, the case study of Karumama, which is not the right, it's pseudonym. His life as a Guru Nanse, a transgender Guru Nanse, his community, his practices, and ultimately the negotiation of his identity as a transgender person within his community. In particular, I discussed the lives of Guru Nanse and his transgender and Nachi daughters around the little Pattini shrine in his home in somewhere close to Colombo. And the yearly ritual Gammadua he performs in his own community as the goddess Pattini, which I described as a unique illustration of his transgender performativity and embodiment. Here I critically read some of the scholars like Ganana Tobesekara, Lindy Worrell, and Malathi D. Alvis, who have developed a larger area of Pattini. But I argue how these readings are again framed in a social sort of heteronormative frameworks of gender and cultural performances. Here I must remember late Dr. Malathi D. Alvis, who read my chapter and gave valuable feedback. Through this, I highlighted the importance of revisiting some well-established discourses on transsubjectivities. I argue that such instances challenge the divisions that exist between genders, social classes, and castes, and narrate alternative interpretations of them. Through this case study, I elaborate how their everyday lives open up new insights to gender, including femininity, motherhood, and sexuality, making it immensely important that these subaltern histories be written. In concluding my thesis, I state that the lives presented here are not exclusive, representative, or final, and there are numerous other possibilities to produce knowledge on trans identities in contemporary Sri Lanka. By highlighting everyday lives, meaning Sri Lankan experiences, I believe that it contributes to a global South discussion on decolonizing current gender and queer theory. The thesis as a whole not only critically questions the normative and established knowledge on gender and sexuality in contemporary Sri Lanka, but also provides certain avenues to rethink of producing alternative knowledge. Rather than providing specific frameworks to place gender and sexuality's discourse, I introduced the study as a process of unframing of what we learned, a space for continuous negotiation, praxis of learning and unlearning. I do not intend to undervalue contemporary LGBTIQ rights movements in Sri Lanka, which presents itself as the liberal savior, as Debanuj Das Gupta introduces. Liberal savior of trans and other gender and sexual minorities. Rather, my attempt is to highlight the inadequacy of the knowledge produced in such spaces and frameworks and the need of alternative readings of their lives. We must start considering the achievements of the rights movements. For example, as I said, gender certificate, healthcare support, in the context of their non-threatening nature to the neoliberal state and the capital market, which create further structural inequalities. As Rahul Rao suggests us, these liberal NGOs, civil society spaces act as agents of global homo-capitalism. Therefore, this study may serve the purpose of providing a starting point to seeing the lives of trans communities from their own perspectives, beyond ideological positions and formal essentialisms that Chatterjee coins the term formal essentialisms. Also, there are several groups or individuals that may self-recognize as transgender persons, but may not have been presented in this study. Therefore, rather than a representative study, I would introduce these stories of as gender snapshots in contemporary Sri Lanka. This thesis provides a small window to a vast world that we have never set foot in. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts, questions, or comments.
Thank you, Kaushalya, for a very interesting presentation. I'm Dr. Farah Hanifa, Head Department of Sociology, and I will take over as chair from now, since Professor Subangi Herath is having some connectivity issues. So again, thank you very much. I encountered Kaushalya because I had the pleasure of examining her thesis, and I've been really impressed with the work that she's done. And it is essential that her work is given a sort of a larger platform. So, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and coming to this talk and presenting your work. Now, I would like to open for questions from the audience. You can either use the raising the hand function, or you can speak directly.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Ms. Kaushalya, for the wonderful presentation and interesting research. I'm MBA student. I'm following my MBA in University of Colombo. So I'm quite interesting regarding the strategy you had used when you are doing your research, the ethnographic strategy. Can you just explain how did you apply ethnographic strategy in this context?
Thank you, Nirmal. This question, in fact, was raised by Professor Hanifa at the panel, why I I have mentioned in my thesis that I feel that focus group discussions and formal interviews are sort of artificial. And I remember Professor Hanifa asking me, why do you think it is artificial, and how do you, what do you mean by it? First of all, I must say I started doing this research. I have been working as a pro bono lawyer and an activist since 2010 with different non-governmental institutions in Sri Lanka on LGBTIQ rights, where I found that there is a large group of trans people, also gay and lesbians, who do not come to NGOs for support. I always feel that they are vulnerable, they are marginalized, and they don't have a voice. But then later on, I found that there is a bigger community than we think, than we see, who do not identify themselves within the framework of NGOs. Then I thought, okay, then we always go and do researches, we do questionnaires, we do uh, we collect people and put them in a room and ask questions. I really felt that this is not the way we should do research. Then I thought of talking to some of my friends. With the relationship I built during my work and other relationships, and I started talking to them, as not as a researcher, but as person who is very curious about their lives. And in by like 2015, I decided that this is the area that I want to study more. Even though I do not identify myself as a transgender woman, I find it is so interesting that how they frame their lives. Then I started talking to them, and then talking to them and see what they feel about their research. And then I planned. So I must say that the field and myself are not two different parts. I mean, when I say field, there is no particular field. These relationships were part of my life as well. I've had to engage with them in different instances, different levels, and we had personal relationships. We had uh, we had to face some problems together, and we had to kind of enjoy the life together. So the field was my part of my life as well. Then, so it wasn't really difficult for me to go to field and build relationships, Nirmal. I think it was about my life as well. So when I say field, that I must again say that the field is also part of my life. And then most of the interviews I did were just talking, like from morning to afternoon sometimes. And I participated in a lot of their dancing practices and festivals, their ceremonies and parties. And all these were my talking to them. But at the end, I had to say that when I write something about them, when I put something in my notebook, I had to go and tell them that I'm going to use this, because it's unethical if I use it without their consent. And I had to read it and translate it back to them. And also the other thing I did was a lot of participation and observing. For example, this Patini performance in Guru Nanse, I have been there for days and days and really enjoying the Patini performance, and also observing a lot of things. And I couldn't take my notebook because our relationships were like very close. It was very awkward to bring a field notebook and write things down. So I had to come home, and no matter how many days I spend with them, I had to come home and write everything down before I forget things. So it was a struggle. And also, as I said, that the emotions were very part of the research. I don't think a researcher can be emotionless, even though we say we should not be judgmental or emotional in research. But my research was full of emotions, and I think these emotions enriched my writing. But at the same time, I understand my privileged position as well. So, so that's how I did my ethnography, Nirmal. I don't know whether I gave a satisfactory answer.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Dishani Seraratne.
Dishani.
Thank you, Dr. Kaushalya, for your excellent presentation. Dishani here. My question is, can you please share with us how your research, in your view, has opened up new areas for future research? Thank you very much.
Yes, there are a lot of things that I have observed through my research, but I didn't publish or didn't write anything. For example, the activism, the recent trends of the activism is really amazing. How they use the internet as a mode of expressing themselves and negotiate their identities, which is very much part of my research. But I thought that it's beyond my research. That's one part. And there was another part that I really want to do further research, the dancing part, but also like the dancing chapter. I think there are so many other things I didn't explore. For example, there are practices during 60s, 70s, were all I had to go and talk to all the old generation, because nothing is written. It was all oral history. And there were many people I couldn't talk to. And I think it's really amazing if we can document the history. For example, they have their own traditions of coming into puberty and going into sex work and living as a family with the mother, and also the changes with the, like, for example, in early 90s, I think that then President R. Premadas gave them community housing facilities where they sort of, build their lives around it. I think these are the areas that are very interesting that I couldn't actually go into because I didn't have enough information to make generalizations. So I think there's a big area that I didn't touch, Dishani.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Dr. Kaushalya.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see any other hands. You may directly ask the question if you have one.
Hi, Kaushalya. My name is Krishan. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation and really appreciate your work. So I just want to know, like, what are the challenges that you encounter during your process, because this is not the most easiest study to do in Sri Lanka. So if you could elaborate a bit more about the challenges that you encountered. Thank you.
Well, the first thing was that the first challenge was, it's more kind of an ethical struggle within myself, and how the question that the eligibility, how can I represent trans community? And that was the question that we always asked, like, how can you represent a community when you write things on behalf of them? But then what is the meaning of representative? Is it the being part of that community? So that's also, it came into my mind, and I discussed with many people. And then that's one of the questions. And then with all my conversations, arguments, pluses and minuses, all the evaluations, that I thought, okay, I should write this history. That's I can write this history. But also I should make sure that I understand my position within the research. That was one of the challenges. I think a lot of the researchers face this challenge. And the other challenge was that the sensitivity. A lot of people did not want to talk about their transgenderism. Especially, I found that from female to male trans people, they didn't want to talk about it. And out of the friendship, they talk, but then they didn't want to put them in the research, which I had to destroy all this, not destroy, actually, I had to keep them away from my writings because it's unethical. And the ethical question was a very big challenge. And sometimes when they talk, after sometimes they come and say, I think you should not write. And at the same time, some people were like very open. They said, can you put my photo in your research? Like they were very happy to be present in my research. Whereas for the confidentiality of others, I had to avoid that. I couldn't put any of the photos, even though they wanted me to. And a lot of them came and said that, can you write to a Sinhala paper about us? And which I didn't want to, because I think that I should do the justice to them by writing. I mean, like, I can't just write about them just for the sake of publishing. So these kind of ethical problems, and other than that, as I said, the emotions were a big part, and a lot of the times I cried, and it was so difficult for me to overcome some of the emotions that I encountered during my fieldwork. So that's also a big part, Krishan, I must say.
Okay, so there is a question in the chat which says, Madam, you miss political perspective on transgender community. I have asked for further explanation of the question, but if you can take it on, Kaushalya.
I believe that political perspective, what Tarindu means is that the political ideology of the trans community, which I actually discussed in length in my research. For example, I have explained how trans communities are seen as HIV carriers, and in the medical sector, they were introduced as risky behavior, people with risky behaviors, and key, I forgot that term particularly, key population, right? Key population. So this pathologized version of medical health is also sort of political interpretation on them, as Foucault suggests us. It's also about the scientific knowledge. And also I have talked about how the state has introduced trans people. For them, they are threatened by the same-sex activities, but they seem unthreatened by the trans community. Has provided some sort of sorry, it's not, that noise coming from. So they have sort of provided circulars to change their gender, but it's always from one binary to another binary. The state doesn't want us to be in the middle. State doesn't wants us to be challenge the binary, right? So they always wants us to be in one of either this side or that side, not in the middle. So that's how they kind of enroll them as proper citizens to the state. So that I have explained in length in my thesis, Tarindu.
Okay, so there are two questions, two new questions. One from Nisheda Indraratne.
Madam, sorry, may some of illegal pharmacy drugs and like that most popular in transgender communities, and also Diana Gamage and Mangal Samadvira spoke about illegal drugs using transgender communities.
I'm not sure what you mean by illegal drugs. They can take hormones from pharmacies.
Oh,
it's not
yes,
illegal.
yes.
Hormones are legal. Hormones are not illegal. Anybody can take hormones. If you think tomorrow you want to become a woman, you can buy a hormone. It's not an illegal thing. You can even go to the hospital and ask for hormones from the doctor for free of charge. That's also possible in Sri Lanka. I'm not sure what Mangala and Diana Gamage told. I'm not really sure what they said, but they are not illegal. They are legal actually in Sri Lanka.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Kaushalya. I guess I can ask the question now, yes?
Yes, Nisheda.
Yes. So I'm an undergrad at UOC studying English. So I was particularly interested when you talked about the challenges you faced in kind of bringing this terminology, this transgender, the terminology to the people you were talking about, to. So can I ask you, if possible, to maybe elaborate on the challenges that you faced?
The first thing was when I say transgender, it's always coming from the terminology that we use in the NGO and civil society sector, right? So there is no word among like transgender among in the like local terms. In Sinhala, there are like we translate it as Sri Sankranti Samaja Bhavi, but it's not the word that the community uses. Some communities use Nachi, which is very they have their own identity, they have their own histories, they have their own language also. I mean, I have collected some of the language, the words in as a part of my thesis at the end. They have their own language. Sometimes I really don't understand how they, like, it's Sinhala, but it's in a way that they have changed some of the words to fit into their own conversation. So they have their own language and they have their unique history. So that's why I found that when we say transgender, it doesn't give the justice to the Nachi community, especially. And but I write this in English, and sometimes I use the Nachi, but sometimes they didn't want to use the Nachi because of the associated stigma around the word. So I had to pick the word transgender for the safe side, right? So I explained the limitation of the word at the beginning. Even though I use the word transgender, they sometimes it may not represent the histories of the some communities. So but there is no, I couldn't invent a new word, so that I had to sort of limit to the English terminology for the understanding of the society.
Okay, thank you.
So much.
And Andy Schubert.
Thank you, Professor Hanifa. Hi, Kaushi. First and foremost, congratulations on PhD. And thank you for a really interesting presentation. You spoke a lot about the trans subjectivity. And I think there's a lot of really important, powerful critiques of kind of the binary and normativeness emerges out of those subjectivities. But you mentioned it in passing, and I realize may not, but I'm sure you've thought about it. You didn't really speak about it a lot. You mentioned in passing that one of the challenges you faced was as a cis queer woman, right? But so can you maybe just share with us a little bit about how this research kind of forced you to think about your own subjectivity as a cis queer woman, or in those ways? I know we want to hear about the transgender subjects, but then what about yourself as a researcher? How did it impact you? Thank you.
Oh, that's a very difficult question, Andy. Well, first of all, I must say that my self-reflection about myself and my identity it was very challenging for me throughout the 5 years. I have been sort of struggling to understand my own subjectivity as well. And queerness as well, and how do I place myself in this research? That's one of the things that I thought at the beginning and throughout the research. But I don't think I have found an answer for you, Andy. I think it's like, for example, when I say that I want to decolonize the scholarly work also, but when I say that I'm doing it for my PhD, which is very structural, very in a neoliberal institution as a university, I also find myself very contradictory positions. So the whole research was like that. I question it, but at the same time I had to place it somewhere. So about me also, that same, Andy, I really don't think I have found an answer, but rather more questions.
Honni?
Thank you. Congratulations, Kaushalya, on finishing the PhD. Some of us know what an arduous task that is. I just wanted to ask you, in the spirit of decolonization, and also because of the issues of questioning the language, especially in English, etc., are not unique to Sri Lanka. So whether you benefited from literature from, Gayatri Reddy to Adnan Hussain in Bangladesh, to Shahnaz Khan in Pakistan, to theorizing on two-spirit people in indigenous communities, trans identities in Caribbean contexts, just so we are not basing our work on Eurocentric and North America-centric scholarship, whether this scholarship has helped you in your research to conceptualize language, everyday life, ritual performance with regards to the trans community. Thank you.
Yes, Ponni, thank you very much for that question. Yes, a lot of things that I found that not much in Sri Lanka, but in other countries, that the terminology and the meanings of that, they were like challenged. Even in countries like Thailand, a lot of there's big scholarship on the Thailand's queer community and the inability to frame it through the Western terminologies. So, and also in Indonesia and in South Africa, also in some certain scholarly work are there. And in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan, they have their own terminologies, and also the cultures and the histories. That is something I brought this throughout the thesis. At the beginning, I sort of tried to find the gap of the literature in Sri Lanka through these, the scholars from Global South who actually challenged showed the limitations of the literature from Global North. And then I tried to place my literature gap in Sri Lanka as such. Yes, Ponni, I didn't speak today because I thought the time would be not enough if I talk about the gap of the literature. Nirmal, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so in your presentation, I noticed that you had used the performativity as a theoretical lens. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, so generally we have known regarding the gender performativity and the performativity of men and women. So the trans performativity is that unique or different from the performativity of men and women? So what are the specialties that you noticed?
First, I must say that performativity is not only about men or women, it's about gender. So when you say gender, it's a spectrum. It's not about men's gender or women's gender. It can be anywhere in between or beyond that. So performativity, I took in my thesis to talk about dancing practices and their histories of Sri Lankan trans communities. Whereas I found that in the West that there are a lot about, trans performativity through, drag queen, drag king performances, which really connects to race. Whereas in Sri Lanka, it connects to the social class and also the caste, the dancing. So I tried to place it, frame it along that way in my thesis. So Nirmal, performativity I don't know how to say whether to say it's unique or not, but it's when you say gender, it's not about men or women.
Thank you. So clear.
Right.
I am not seeing any hands raised. Are there any others who would like to ask questions? I was just kicked out of the meeting, so I may be just missing some. So if you have questions, please go ahead and ask.
Sorry, just to add something, really, not even raise a question, but also just to say, I think it's also, this question about performativity, that like the theorization of performativity was also in a way about trans performances, right? Like it's about the drag, right? And so there is so much of trans in the theorization of performativity itself, not just about men and women, but like, that performativity itself comes in a way, not of course not trans bodies, but like, the trans performance itself. Yeah, I just want to say that. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? No. Okay. So I think we can conclude the meeting. I will just say a brief thank you, and we will have a sort of a official concluding also. Kaushalya, again, thank you very much. Really appreciate your research, your work, and your insights, and another great presentation. And thank you again for participating. So I'll hand it over to the organizing individuals to take it forward from here.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you again, Dr. Kaushalya. It has been a very fruitful discussion and an insightful seminar for us. On behalf of the Department of Sociology, I would like to thank you all for joining with us today and look forward to meeting you again at the next monthly seminar in March. Have a great day. Thank you again.
Thank you.